I don't always love what I do, but I mostly love what I do. I think if you don't have love in what you do, people can feel it, people can see it. Loving what you do, loving your work, love and work are complex because you can self exploit sometimes. You can overwork yourself in service of the idea that you love what you do.
What stories are we telling and why? Our stories are so numerous. They cover the whole range of what to be human is all about.
Welcome to season 2 of Are We Our Work, an ongoing research project delving into our relationship to work, what goes into that toil. That's essentially what season 1 specifically looked at. Season 2 is curious about love. How love often seeps into our work, how work seeps into our love. Researcher Tiffany Ibrahim sat with a range of guests and spoke to them about their relationship to love and how that emotional experience plays out. Season 2 also sees Are We Our Work introduce 2 co-hosts. That's us, myself, Kimu Busielo, and
Naadira Patel.
the two of us will be reflecting on some of the broad strokes and common threads through season 2 of Are We Our Work.
So, co-host, what are we talking about today?
Today's episode is titled Cultural Funding.
Oh wait, this is the one that I'm in, right?
This is your episode.
Okay,
So,
then.
Tiffany sat with yourself as well as Tammy Langtry. Maybe if I can just give some context, Naadira Patel is an artist and the creative director of Softwork Studio, as well, of course, as the co-host of Are We Our Work. And maybe you want to give an intro for Tammy, since you know her much better than I do.
Yeah, Tammy is someone I've known for quite a number of years. We were in varsity together at the same time. She is currently operating as an independent curator.
So yourself as artist and Tammy as curator explore the complexities of community building. You look at institutional support within creative pursuits or lack thereof, and the emotional labor involved in bringing artistic visions to life. You give us a sneak peek into the exhilarating and frustrating journey of collaboratively making art.
The individual versus the collective, and I hate that it always has to be a versus rather than a coexistence. Something that Tammy and I talk about a lot in many different occasions.
And I was also so glad that I got to sit with you for some behind
I've been
the scenes.
interviewed twice now
Right.
about the same thing.
Right, so please do stick around at the end of this episode where I sit with Naadira and reflect on some of the ideas that she shared in this episode.
Yeah, I look forward to chatting more with you about it.
All right.
I will speak about love in the context of boundaries. If love is a sharing act, a giving act, a connected act, then how much is that for yourself? I think the value of going independent now has been to try and find, because I've also been so disillusioned, find the love in the labor again, and what kind of labor feels loving and what kind of labor feels exploitative. What kind of labor is helpful in its universality and what kind of labor is actually just exploitative again. There's ways of work that is not building a life that I love to participate in, either because it's built other ideas of anxiety or being in this washing machine that is constantly moving and tense and chaotic and not grounded and sustainable. Because if my life is not loving and what I want to be in, then what is the point? I really struggled with the word or the idea of being a curator and what that meant, especially because I thought, or what I was seeing was that the infrastructure in which the traditional Western European idea of a curator was not really there. So this idea that you have access to certain art spaces, you have a thriving art economy and an art world. And I mean, if I tie different elements of being a curator together, I didn't see it as necessarily archival work, but definitely about how do we construct ways of being in and amongst each other? Like, how do you relate to this thing? And the art industry doesn't really teach you any of that. So it also then becomes really difficult to find the nuance between that title and that role and actually how does it land within an art ecosystem. And partly this idea of informality is interesting and nice for the art economy because so many other things can be birthed from that space. So many other ways of relating to work and productivity and output and what culture could mean.
Yeah, but not everybody's caught in the net.
Exactly.
And I'm interested in the hands that are controlling the net.
Private money can make decisions about who gets shown, who gets resourced, who becomes something. A lot of people don't apply for the public money for projects because the process to apply for it is so cumbersome that people just don't do it. So then the projects that do apply get it, and that selection is kind of, I don't know, I think that selection process there is determined by who is willing to go through the rigmarole of applying for public funding.
I also wonder if I want to be sensitive about how I say this, but the state's view of art being captured for nation building purposes, in particular what the Rainbow Nation is idealized to be, against what are more organic grassroots movement building around artistic practice. It just, for me as an outsider, feels like completely different worlds. Mm-hmm. So there's that interests me. But the other thing I would also like us to talk about is the degree of organization within the more organic grassroots movement of cultural practice. How organized are things? How are institutions able to support the organized? The financial need is there for the artists. The community of practice could be there. Why is the glue just not feeling that tight between individuals who want to exist within the artistic ecosystem? Sorry if that's too critical.
No, it's totally on point. Mm-hmm. If I can take a stab at it, I would say competition. You kind of brought into this art world from the art school moment in quite a competitive way. The artist is singular genius. The artist as singular sole author of a brilliant piece of work or a brilliant project. So there's this push towards the singular genius, the highly competitive, it's my turn, I'm in the limelight, I've got the solo show. We all get caught up in that. It's less about producing a community of making, of thinking, of working, and more about where's my next gig? How relevant am I? And everyone is operating, I think, from a place that is very much grounded in a fear of irrelevance. How long are people going to have my name in circulation? How long are people going to be paying attention to my work, my project, what I'm doing? I mean, the fear of irrelevance is quite a big one. Almost every artist I've ever spoken to feels it at some point. And so a lot of people also overperform in order to remain on top. And to remind yourself, I'm not falling behind. I've got this. I'm part of something good here.
I think that's a very fair, real reflection on what kind of psychology is directing our input into this economy. And I think about art not being a circular economy. It doesn't circulate, it doesn't go wide, or it doesn't think of itself as a broader communal experience or social experience rather than this object making, which I think is very much one sign of the time of globalization and where we're kind of going to socially. But I think competition is a fair answer. And this idea that you're just meant to produce something beautiful, meaning you can opt out of all the other checkboxes of what it means to be within an industry.
Well, competition and capitalism.
Totally.
Where have you seen promising starts or signs of an alternative way of being and existing in the art world?
There are some community projects that I think are really exciting. There are also some artists who understand that their practice needs to be within a certain geography with certain groups of people, and it doesn't concern itself with the output as much as it concerns itself with the process and the people that it's connected to. That's some of the people either that I've worked with or I'm observing and whose practice I really value. So I think it does exist. In Joburg particularly, it's very challenging because if you look at the landscape of the country, we could argue that maybe Joburg is one of the cities that has the most galleries. The way it's scripted as a commercial activity is very clear. I think it exists. It's just you have to really fight for it in Joburg.
And have you seen institutions that are supporting artists in more open-minded and nurturing ways that feed art back into community?
I do think it's a different challenge on its own. Some institutions maybe are doing that project-based, so you can piecemeal support an artist on their work, but you can't holistically support an artist's work. That does rely sometimes on patrons, so you kind of, on the one hand, relying on the institution, other hand, relying on the patron, on the other hand, relying on like the wider economy of cultural funding. This idea that you have to rely on many hands and many institutions, whether those are individuals or wider ideas of institutions, you kind of got to spread yourself across all of these things in order to make something happen, which is a lot of juggling and strategic thinking and political balances, but are artists also willing to do that work? Who does that work? So yeah, it's complicated, and I think maybe that's why the glue is so hard to come by.
Why did you choose to become a curator?
Because it touches on all these focuses, lenses, roles, and ways of being, of producing a social interaction, a moment, a context, making sense of certain things. But that has looked different at different points in my very small career. In some instances, it's just been working in a studio with an artist, literally researching and writing.
I mean, it's quite a supportive role.
Totally.
My experience with speaking to curators is the issue around a lack of a job description. I'm interested in how you build and also draw boundaries, how you give but also expect to be compensated, how you set the standard of your non-job descriptive job and career, and how so much of your networking is about infiltrating into the personal lives of the people that you're supporting.
I used to call a curator being a Victorinox, which was this idea of being a utilitarian tool that needed to have multiple functions on hand at any time in order to fix. I'm at the point now where I try and be as transparent as possible in the way I like to work, which is very much like prepare as much as an artist, because I can't thumb suck what you need, when, how. Because there's so much emotional work, psychological work, imagining work, damage control as well, either around an artist or an institution or a project. You kind of need the artist to come in as your ally in a lot of instances. So yeah, it's a very open-ended role.
In one of my jobs, I had to write the job description for what I was doing 2 years into the process of doing it. That job had not existed before, and nobody really knew the bounds of it or the limitations of it. Every job I've had, the job descriptions have never been clear. And I would leave at the point where I felt like this is going beyond what I understood the job description to be. I didn't know that I would be here to make somebody coffee. I didn't know that I would be here to go buy people's groceries, get their dry cleaning. These things were never spoken about. I don't want to do these things.
And I think art is a particularly complex industry within which to design job descriptions, because it can extend and bleed into so many things. You know, what is healthy containment in a creative space?
I think often there isn't containment because people don't actually know what they want out of someone they're going to employ. They just want someone who is going to be able to fill all of the different roles as things come up. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Being a Victorinox, as Tammy explains it, can be a very useful way to operate. It's incredibly powerful when you are able to problem solve on multiple levels, on intellectual, conceptual, theoretical, practical, technical levels. That makes for an all-rounded, amazing kind of way of working. So I think it's not a bad thing to be the kind of person, or to be in a position where you are like plugging holes and fixing things and solving problems. But I think often when people employ people in the art world or in galleries or in institutions, that kind of thing is not quite said clearly.
And the artist is only one function within that moving world. And so is a curator thinking about all those other elements as well.
Can you talk about the fractures that sometimes happen between the artist and the curator? I've heard artists accuse their curators of sabotaging their practice.
Totally.
I've heard curators crying about the lack of recognition of their continuous and ongoing giving.
I think if there isn't a clear sense of where we're going in this, there can be so much miscommunication, so much misunderstanding, and so much reliance on things that were actually never promised or actually defined. Because I do think there can be codependencies between artists and curators.
And why is that an understandable pattern to fall into?
Because curators, I think sometimes curators' strength is seeing the blind spots in an artist, or being able to wield an artist in certain ways. And so artists, I think, can get comfortable in that. But then there are also ways that a curator wants to wield an artist that can feel very extractive or exploitative. So it is a very sensitive relationship to deal with. But I think that codependency is the idea of blind spots and how someone else can kind of fill gaps, build things around your work that either you don't see or you see but needs to be verbalized in a different mode and in a different space. It's an advocate sometimes for your work, and so you can step back and rely on someone else to advocate for you where you don't need to anymore. And that obviously is an instance where an artist invites you as a curator, but there are other instances where you court an artist. And there are some professional practices, of course. There are things that spill outside of what it means to court an artist that I've, not to say I've experienced per se, but ideas where you're taking an artist for lunch and you're doing certain things, but once the exhibition ends, they're like, well, where are you now? You've just abandoned me and you're not living up to all of this courting that we started this relationship with. There's also situations where the artist, their ego is so big, or they have such a big ego where they believe your job is just to run behind them and catch whatever they drop. And it's a very disempowering role. It's a false sense of what contribution to a project means, I think.
I completely understand why people are so critical of the egos of artists and the pain and harm that ego can cause to a practice. But if I'm honest, I also think that a large part of what helps people get through that kind of world and industry is an ego that is intact. I think to be an artist, you must, on some level, be a narcissist. And I want to talk about that. How do we make space for the unpleasant necessities that sometimes are required of us in very cutthroat industries? The selfless, the completely selfless, good luck building a career.
No, yeah, it's such a, you phrased that so beautifully, actually. The ego, I think for a lot of people, in my experience, a lot of it comes from a place of fear. We're all narcissists.
Yeah, I agree.
We have to be narcissists to make art. But I don't think I don't think it's impossible to have a career as an artist without a big ego or a nasty one. I think it is possible to work in quieter ways, to work in gentler ways, to work in more respectful ways with whatever community or network you choose and still do good work. I had some very unpleasant interactions with artists once I encountered their egos in the flesh that then also shifted how I thought about their work. And I think it's a complex conversation to be had around the artist and their work. How do you separate the artist from their work? Is it better to live with the ignorance of not knowing the person but loving the work? What happens when you know that the person is actually just really not a good human being? And we have instances of also perpetrators of violence.
Why can't a bad person be a good artist and that's enough of a contribution?
Because the work is not the only thing that exists in society. How you are with people, how you as a person are within your community and your networks is equally important because you are the maker of the work that we look at. And so how you treat people, how you speak to people, how you exist within your community, I think is equally important.
Interesting. If I compare it to the legal world, it doesn't matter. You take on a client,
right,
and that's who you represent, and it is about the jurisprudence that you're affecting via this person's story that matters. You actually have to break away from any morality around your perceptions of the human who happens to have the case that matters, the strategic case that will make an impact on our law. How can we just expect the model human being to also be the model artist? Where are we making space for the flaws?
It's complex and messy still in my head because there's also, once you make work, that work is now outside of yourself. It's also of a particular version of you from a particular time that you made it. I agree, there has to be space. Well, one, people change. There has to be space for the changing human being, the flawed human being, but it depends. We have a case of an artist who is accused of rape and murder. What then happens with their work? Is someone who is at the more extreme end of being a perpetrator of violence, how does their work live on and have a legacy when you now understand that this person is also capable of this? So how do we make room for the complexity of two truths or multiple truths, multiple existences?
This is my issue with having a career that gives you a stage. It puts you on a pedestal. I think it's the most unrealistic idealism we can push.
And I take it back to funding again, because I think the lack of funding means that some work happens and some other work that could potentially happen doesn't happen. So the private funders get to write a cultural landscape by funding particular kinds of work to happen. Those get visibility, and that becomes the cultural landscape that we are in. And so a lot of other potential beautiful ways of working that are maybe more grassroots, more community-based, often don't see the light or don't get as much visibility because they're not getting funding. And sometimes if they do get the funding, it's written with very particular agendas that fulfill either corporate CSI briefs or, fulfill some kind of image of community-based, artist network-based work that, then takes away from what the actual work is.
Being an artist, I imagine, is something that involves a lot of solitude, and you build this intimate relationship to your work, but at some point you have to let the world in, which is quite unique from other industries. You platform your work, place it on a pedestal, and allow people to either shower praise on it or critique it or trash it. Yeah, I'm curious about what impact you think this has on your relationship to that work. I also just want to bring it back to what that does to the love.
Yeah, incredibly exposing. It terrifies me, actually. I find the anxiety of that level of exposure debilitating. It can paralyze me to the point that I don't want to make work in that way. What I tend to do as a way to continue making and to continue finding love in a way of working is I shift to working in design and working collaboratively with people where it's not all on me. And that feels like a cop-out when I say it. And I'm okay with it sounding like that or being that, because when I'm working collaboratively with someone else on a project, I feel a bit more free than trying to do it myself. Because what the fuck will people say? Part of making it as an artist is that you need to be able to get over what you think people will say, how people will respond to the work, but that comes with a certain level of confidence that is bolstered by a certain kind of support that you have. I make work with my own money, with my own time, with no attachment to any art space in particular. And so I think about making work more as something not for the sake of showing, but for a sake of processing.
Can you elaborate a bit on the support that you mentioned or the lack thereof? Yeah, it's something I really want to get into because it's an overlap from Vuma and Colleen in Emotional Imprint to you and Tammy. The four of you speak in quite a lot of depth about a lack of institutional support. Just now, when you referenced that there's a particular confidence that comes with being a supported artist, what were you referring to specifically?
Specifically, I think what I was just referring to is the support of a deal with an art space, a gallery space, for example, or having, and this is the bigger one, is having a national funding system for arts. And it's pretty much lacking here. I spoke about that quite a bit with Tammy that day, what the kind of national arts funding looks like, what private funding looks like, and how difficult it is to actually get funding to do work. When you have funding to be able to make work, regular funding or regular stipend, your possibilities of thinking about the potential to make work are much greater. And what happens here with a lot of people is that because there aren't so many support structures in place for artists, for musicians to produce work, to produce in the way that they want to, you end up having to do things either for money in order to then support yourself. So to take on the money work to support the arts work, the actual thing that you want to do, or as Colleen refers to, this deep frustration about working for the landlord. The landlord is also the gallerist. The landlord is also who's in charge of deciding who gets what little pools of money are available. You try to make work within the structures that are there, that are available for making, for producing music, for having gigs, for having shows, but it's limited, and it therefore also limits the potential of how far you can think about what it is you want to do and what communities you want to generate. So from the beginning, it's already lacking unless you have access to private money.
Some of the reasons that were put forward in Emotional Imprint and then in my conversation around the lack of cultural care within music specifically was because of music's association with the underbelly of society. So music means clubs mean booze, and with all of that comes the social ills, which the people wielding the levers of the institutional mechanisms want to turn a blind eye to. But what I found myself thinking was you wouldn't necessarily associate these social ills, at least not in any overt way, to art. And so why has art also seemed to have been left destitute by the powers that be?
This is a very important question. That's such a good observation. So it's different to what happens with music, definitely. There's a lack of an understanding or appreciation for the value that arts education can have in producing a really rich culture. We need to introduce more alternative options for what people can do with their time and their energy and their ideas, and that will produce a different kind of society. We have amazing artists that have produced work in South Africa, often many of them unrecognized, often the ones that didn't have a kind of public stage or platform still are not recognized. Yeah, there's a missed opportunity in so many ways for what support could do. I don't know why. I don't know why it's not recognized.
I think it was touched on in both episodes again about how at a national or at a state level, or maybe even just at an institutional level, creating always means looking back. And so unless your project somehow speaks to apartheid or rainbow nation building.
Yeah. I think, to be honest, I'm now also understanding why this episode is called Cultural Funding. There's a kind of misrecognition of thinking about funding for culture. When the Department of Arts and Culture thinks about what kinds of culture it wants to produce, it's kind of missing the point. So what kind of culture, what kind of arts landscape can be produced by providing funding? I don't think there's an imagination for where it could go. So there's the tendency to look back. What can we produce that becomes representative of our past? And not that we shouldn't find ways to present or memorialize or visualize or come to terms with or think about narrativizing our past through art. I think there is possibility there, but the imagination is just lacking for what you can do with actually small pockets of money spread out across many more spaces and many more people. But then also the second reason I'm understanding the cultural funding, and that was very much connected to what this program was that I was part of in September last year, the Power Talks program that was hosted by the Goethe Institute. They were producing this project to question and to come to terms with the role of European cultural funders, specifically in South Africa. As artists, we're often relying on European cultural funders to make work happen here. And the Goethe Institute, as one example, is one of the funders that provides the most funding for work to actually happen in South Africa. That's not to say that it's all amazing. And part of this project in September was to think about the complexity of what it means for a European cultural funder to be such an important and immense source or resource for the production of work, and what that does to producing a particular kind of work, what kind of cultural landscape it produces. So what does funding and where it comes from and its context, the context of the money, what does that also do for producing a particular kind of culture? You know, you have a European funder that gives you support here, to produce work here, and that's great. If you want to go do a residency, you have to find another relationship with a different European nation or different country that allows you mobility funds or a residency, production fees. And a lot of South African artists are then looking for those opportunities to go and produce elsewhere, and a lot is missed out on here. I mean, there are residency programs here, but they're always struggling for funding. They're always struggling to keep themselves going, actually.
It's kind of morbid.
I feel like maybe I'm making it sound more dire than it is, but it does feel dire. But otherwise, it's private funding. It's private funding, and with private funding, you kind of automatically shape and determine the kind of work that is going to be made, because funding comes with a particular agenda, in a way.
Gatekeeping.
Yeah.
Are We Our Work is an independent research project and podcast anthology series centered around questions of love, fulfillment, relationships, identities, and work, co-hosted by Naadira Patel and myself, Kimugu Cielo. This episode was produced and edited by Tiffany Ibrahim, sound design by Joao Orekia, music by Vuma Levine, illustration by Softwork Studio, and web design by Sky Quadlin. To stay up to date with the project, please check out at Are We Our Work on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening.
See you soon.